begin with the land acknowledgement, acknowledging the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, including the Tsleil-Waututh, Coquitlam, Squamish, and Musqueam nations on which SFU Burnaby campus is located. One thing I've learned about the land acknowledgement is it's important not just to say the words, but also to convey something personal about it. And I want to try and convey what I'm trying to do to give back to the people who provide this land for us. And one of the things that I came to realize is one of the things that I can help with is conveying wisdom. Not my wisdom, because if you ask somebody to associate words with Randy, wise would not be one of them. But I think in my position as the director of an institute where I work with people to create new knowledge, have the vehicle to actually help convey wisdom to people who come to the SFU Burnaby campus, as well as over Zoom land right now. Last year in May, we held a conference down in the SFU Vancouver campus on social-cultural neuroscience. Some of you were there. It was a full day. It was actually more of a workshop where we sat and sort of talked about things around social-cultural neuroscience, how to really integrate social challenges, cultural challenges into understanding factors that support brain health, factors that contribute to resilience. And one of the people that came there was actually Michael Yellowbird. He gave probably one of the most engaging talks about the intersection between ideas, Western ideas and neuroscience, and Indigenous ways of knowing, and trying to contextualize all this information. We were blown away by that perspective, that wisdom. And the rest of the workshop was fantastic as well. So if you do go to the website for the Institute and find the white paper that was crafted from that workshop, you'll find it was quite and engaging. And we had some good discussion and had some good ideas, I think, going forward, which we'll try and act on as we go forward. So I'm very happy to welcome Michael to SFU to present today to you all. Michael's a professor in the Faculty of Social Work. He just stepped down from the deanship, so he has now free time all over the place, correct? Michael has been at several locations, including UBC, UKansas, Arizona, and North Dakota State. But he's here today to talk to us about the Coyote, Coyote neuroscience and determinants of Indigenous brain health and settler colonialism. So Michael, podium is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. Okay, thank you so much. And I'm glad to be back to this area here. I haven't been back since the last time Randy invited me over, so it's a pleasure to be back. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. I hope that what I share today is interesting and kind of makes sense, and hopefully in some way it kind of applies to how I think, we should integrate more understanding of Indigenous people's social and cultural factors in brain health. So I always talk right away about this first slide. My two of my four daughters. And so the oldest, they're sitting with the yellow is my oldest daughter. She's 17 now. She was, I think, 11 when this picture was taken. And my second youngest, meditating. And one of the things that I found in the work that I do, and I do a lot of work in what they call contemplative science and Indigenous people, is to understand the effects that contemplative practices and ceremony have on the brain, the spirit, and the body of people. So it's been fun to kind of, for me, who's a non-neuroscientist, kind of by default, someone who's tried to interpret neuroscience for Indigenous communities as well as in social work, is to kind of look at all this literature and this research and then try to figure out, like, how does this apply to what our people were doing at some point, in our history? And what does it mean for people's health today? And what are we missing? And what are we doing right? And those are different kinds of questions I have. So one of the things I think that you see here that we're doing right is, I hope we're doing right, is to try to get people back into that contemplative sacred space. science is pretty good when you start looking at, how sacred space and sacred thinking and sacred being, raises our level of hope and optimism. And we know a little bit about now what happens to the brain and to the body when we get into these different kinds of states that our ancestors were often in when they were practicing ceremony or just being during the day. Like I've heard that from how many people today about the sun already. The sun's out there. The sun's out there, right? So it's a very primal sort of, I think, emotion that we have. We have a connection to these beautiful kinds of things that exist in the world, And so what I'd like to do is kind of talk a little bit about that. So I've entitled this Coyote Practices Neuroscience, and I think there's a trickster part in what we do. And there's another part, there's the shadow side and the other sort of helpful side. And so what I think we'll do is to kind of move towards that lighter side, but talk a little bit about some of the stuff that, I think are barriers to good brain health and well-being. So I just want to talk a little bit about kind of my interest here in terms of what I think socio-cultural factors are and how strongly they're influenced by the evolution and the history of Indigenous people's brains and bodies. And I've also developed a really strong sort of interest in cultural neuroscience. And I've really looked at that and thought, wow, it's really interesting when you start thinking about, how culture, evolves with our genes and evolves with brain and evolves with the rest of our body. Which one is the horse, which one is the cart, which one is the egg, which one is the chicken, right? So I'm thinking about that, but there's discussion about how things co-evolve. So I think about, how past and present experiences that we've had as Indigenous people really affect our brain structure and the plasticity of our brain and the function, right? What happens to our brain? And so I've become really interested in how our reaction or how our occupation of our environments changes the expression of our brains and our cells and our, these molecular structures in the body and triggers, responses by our genes and other parts. Really interested in that and thought about that a lot and thought about what people were like 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, and so on, and what's happening in the here and now. Really interested in also about brain waves and specialized brain cells, and those kinds of things. I'm looking at those, but how our neurotransmitters and modulators change, under different conditions. And of course, the last thing I think, that's been understudied in terms of in social work, for instance, and I think a lot of other helping professions, is the contribution that our gut and our gut health plays in our mental health and our well-being. I know this is something that we were just having this conversation earlier about how the Chimene Indians in the Bolivian rainforest have a very, very different brain than we do in the Western world. These are hunter-gatherer populations like our ancestors were maybe 200 years ago or maybe 300 years ago or so, where they lived mostly off the land. And their protein needs weren't really extensive or excessive, but they had a lot of plant, based foods, and they had very high levels, or they have very high levels of fiber in their diet. And we know now, just from a lot of the research, that fiber in plants feed a lot of the good bacteria in the gut, which then creates diversity, which then protects the brain, which then protects the heart, which protects the health of folks. So we know there's been a big sort of shift in that terms of diet. And so we were, again, talking about the Chimene Indians, and I think it's like they have their brain aging compared to us in the Western world, first world countries and other countries even more so, that they're 70% less aging of their brains, meaning that they're probably going to, have a much less vulnerability to getting a neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and so on. Even though they have these particular genes that they have, like APOE4 genes that are sort of one of the predictors whether or not a person will get Alzheimer's disease, they have the same frequency of that in their population, yet they're not getting Alzheimer's like we do. Interesting. Yet they don't have the brain atrophy that we do. And that gets back to why, right? So we've talked about some of the hypotheses earlier. One hypothesis I was talking about earlier was that the parasite hypotheses, and that's one they talk about, is that at one time our ancestors had parasites in our body, a lot more than we do now. And we learned to coexist with parasites in our body. We just couldn't have too much of a heavy load. And once, the theory goes is that parasites in our body keeps the immune system sort of, tuned up, and it helps it from going awry. So the body doesn't then begin to attack like the myelin sheath, on the nerve cells, which causes MS or Parkinson's disease or whatever. So that's just the condition of living, right? So we've sort of, in a sense, over-sanitized, over-antisepticized our bodies so that we're living in this world with all kinds of water that's got, chlorine in there and so on, and the foods and stuff we're eating is all sort of, processed foods and stuff, doesn't really do a lot for us other than harm our health. So I'm kind of interested in that, these, and I think that's one of those socio-cultural factors, right? So let's see here. Okay, so this is the model I've worked at from before, but it's really sort of, I call it earth-based contemplative practices model medicine wheel. And what I've tried to do with this model is just say, well, this is what it is. It's this holistic model called the medicine wheel. I think most of us know about that. But what I've tried to do is kind of think about it in terms of our culture and our perceptions and experiences, how they shape the plasticity, not only of our brain, because we think brain plasticity, but we've got plasticity throughout our body. Unfortunately, we've got a lot of plastic in our bodies too as well. So kind of brings a new kind of concept to the idea of neuroplasticity, right? We were just talking about how much plastic is in our water now. So if you're drinking bottled water, I'm looking out there, no one's got bottled water. So you're drinking all these, nano and microplastics, right? So the idea is that, all these things kind of help, shape our brain and our body. One of the things that I think in terms of recovering our health, not just brain health, but the integrity of all of our health, right, is to then take a dive into, ancestral knowledge and practices. How do we rediscover those kinds of things? My belief is that we can change a lot of those things now today. I think the science is there. I think we've only moved just from a few generations, maybe about 10 generations or so from being hunter-gatherers. And, it's not that long a time where we would have these mutations in our body where we would be, be able to shift, and live the way people are living in society today and not get the level of diabetes and hypertension and so on that folks are getting, right? So I think that's one of the things is that it's important to kind of have a return to traditional practices. And there's a lot of them in there that you see in the research, like movement, running, sleep, laughter, collectivism, fasting, contemplative practices, adaptive stress, circadian rhythms are things we were talking about today at lunch, and being outdoors. So the research is pretty clear on those kinds of things, which I think is really important to remember. These are kind of normal things that Indigenous people did before colonization. So I want to frame it today then in a way that kind of has trickster at the sort of center. And I think trickster, of course, as you see, is a coyote who's a survivor, but embodies this complexity and duality, right? The heroic side of coyote can challenge the conventional neuroscientific thinking, right? There's one way to think about the brain, there's one way to think about science and so on. And we should be thinking about it in a more holistic way. So I think it's really important to embrace Indigenous cultural practices. And what really makes sense to me for Indigenous people now today is equanimity, a sense of feeling well-being, a sense of kind of, being okay where we're at, but also grit, which means, of course, we continue to move towards returning and restoring traditional knowledge and so on. Coyote here, that's a great picture, don't you think, Coyote? Serves as the harbinger of better brain health and resilience through pathways of cultural adaptability, which I think, we've done somewhat, and movement and contemplative practices, and kind of I'll talk about some of those today. But before I get to that, talking about that, I need to talk a little bit about settler colonialism. So settler colonialism, I think, is real straightforward on the definition. I think this is one of those big disruption pieces that really needs to be talked about a lot more in terms of one of those socio-cultural factors, because Settler colonialism, takes claim of environments for replacing existing conditions and members of those environments with those of the settlement of the settlers, right? And part two of this is intrinsically connected to this is the displacement or the elimination of existing residents. Get rid of them. Don't want them around, particularly through destruction of their environment and society. So this is a really famous picture that was painted in the States by a guy by the name of John Gast. I don't know if you've ever seen this picture. It's called American Progress, but it's really about manifest destiny. So today we're in another period of manifest destiny. We're about to become the 51st state of the United States. So you know what I'm talking about. You heard Donald Trump say that, right? He's going to annex Canada and then the Panama Canal and Greenland, right? So anyway, when I look at this picture, it's hard to see this picture. Hopefully it's not too hard. But when you see at the center, this is the picture of this person who's levitating above the ground is called Columbia. Now, Columbia is sort of the female counterpart to Columbus, right? The discoverer. So you see Columbia there sort of levitating above the earth, and she's carrying in her right arm there a book. And what do you think that book is about? Bible? It's actually even more powerful than the Bible. It's a school book. It's the inculcation of the domination and the white supremacy. It's kind of what she's kind of the school book, right? She's also carrying there a cable line of telegraph, wires. And it's interesting about this particular picture. If you can see in front of her, you can see the Indians on the run. And you can see in front of her the darkness that she's chasing away, and behind her is the lightness, right? So these people had no value, and neither did all the other things. So if the very bottom, you can't see it too well, but on the left side, the very bottom, there's a bear, there's a grizzly bear. The grizzly bear is running. Above the Indians there, the buffalo, and the buffalo running. And right near the horse there by the water, there's a wolf. And these are what people consider to be the top apex predators at the time. Wolves, bears, Indians, buffalo, right? Well, buffalo weren't the apex predators, but they were a threat to settler colonialism. So they almost all wiped them all completely out, right? And they barely came back. Buffalo never came back 100%. They had to be rebred with cattle to, create more buffalo. So they're not wild buffalo anymore, right? In front of that, you can see the settlers coming in the wagons and the stagecoaches, and there you can see in the center of the picture at the bottom, you see the miners coming in, and behind them are the people coming and tearing up the earth. That was farming that was coming in, and with that came all the issues around food and chemicals and Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, if you've ever read that book, DDT. So everybody know what DDT is? Yeah. When I was a kid on a reservation, we raised horses. I used to ride horses all the time. And all the farmers, the white farmers there, the settlers had all the cattle, and they had these huge rubbing posts or sort of like containers. And they had strips of cloth running down, and they were soaked with DDT. And so the cows would go under there on the hot days to rub under there because the flies were, on the cattle. So you could smell it when you ride by, you'd look at it. We didn't know it was DDT. We didn't mess with it because it smelled bad. But that was all over in the community. And of course, DDT, what it did was poison our lakes, and it poisoned, the cattle, and it poisoned the meat, so on, until it was banned and then sent down to Mexico, and other places, Now we see that now in farming now today, the same thing. Anyway, so the point is that's was kind of the civilization that was happening, right? So-called civilization. And that was kind of the beginning of settler colonialism. So the colonization of indigenous people, is this process, of course, where Group of people migrate into a region, they take control of the indigenous population, they impose their own laws, culture, religion, and science, their own way of seeing the world. And it has really significant, long-lasting negative impacts on the indigenous people, including all these ways. Well, the first thing that was huge with indigenous people, I've just developed this new passion for reading about plagues. You know, my background is in health, and my PhD, I did it on healthcare, health behavior, and utilization. So I did a lot of study of epidemiology and infectious diseases and so on. Sort of led me down that path. So I start reading about it now because of the growth spurt we're having now with avian bird flus happening. And of course, it's going to put some heavy pressure on things like eggs and so on, right? And contaminate flocks of chickens. So those things will all have a big impact. So that's right now the coming plague, and we're not doing too much about it right now, just kind of watching it, right? So when diseases came here, like smallpox, measles, and influenza, they were just very new to the population. We know that now, that there were some diseases here before, but nothing like these zoonotic diseases that would jump from these European cows and chickens and sheep and pigs to people in the Middle Ages. Even there were not even rats here, you probably know that. But, where the plagues developed was from the rats in Europe, and, wiped out during the Justinian period, wiped out probably 80% of the European population, right? And so those people developed some kind of immunity from that. And so, what I was reading about, looking at if you generationally survived the Black Plague, for instance, you had about a 40% chance of surviving it again, whereas someone who was never exposed probably had 90 to 95% of dying from the plague. So if you can imagine that was happening in Europe during the Bronze Age, where, right around the Bronze Age, in that period where all these farmers were moving in from places like the Ukrainian area and stuff, they're moving in, and there were huge groups of hunter-gatherers, and all of a sudden they were gone, wiped out from disease. And that's how farming started. Farming didn't start from like the operation of war or anything. It just, disease sort of cleared the path so that all the hunter-gatherers were wiped out. And of course, the farmers then took over, began to plant and raise. And that's kind of the second wave, I guess, for agriculture. So these had a devastating impact. I'll read a little bit about that. The loss of land, displacing, indigenous people, outnumbering them. Interesting now that when we talk about indigenous people, we never really talk much about how many people live in the urban area versus live in the rural areas anymore. Those numbers can be as high as 70, 80% of the people that live in the urban area are no longer living on the land, or no longer living like their ancestors lived, right? And there's a cost to that too as well. Cultural connection, policies that led to that. Violence, of course, saw that. Socioeconomic marginalization, of people, poverty, intergenerational trauma. People talk a lot about that, continues to impact indigenous people today. So in the talk that I do, I think about trauma, then I think about, so where else did trauma happen? So I like to think about it, when I talk to some of my colleagues and when I read a bit about, what's happening in the body, I think about molecular colonization, how we get colonized at the very deep level in the body. And these traumatic experiences, of course, are part of that. And this traumatic decay that's happening, and destruction that's happening at the smallest part of the body, we don't see it in real time, but it's happening, slowly to all of us right now as you age, right? If you don't eat right, you don't sleep right, you don't, laugh enough, you're not doomed, but, you're sort of, getting chipped away. So I always think about this particular one, and I know all these neuroscientists, it's kind of uncomfortable to talk with you in front of the neuroscientists because they think, yeah, I saw that slide, or something, But when I think about this, I think, okay, it's interesting to think about chronic stress and enzymatic colonization of the body and the brain and trauma, how that happens. And I think about what I just talked about, settler colonialism, these different kinds of waves that happen to people then it starts to become really clear to me that there are different parts of the body that are affected, right? These dendritic spines, I've read, I don't know how many papers on this, but I thought, oh, this is really interesting to think about in terms of how chronic stress begins to, degrade those dendritic spines. And when you have populations of people like Indigenous people that are chronically stressed because of food, I'm not talking about food shortage, I'm talking about food that they shouldn't be eating, or not sleeping, or racism, or those things that exist, all these socio-cultural factors, then there's an impact happening in the brain that we don't see, right? And of course, this is important because these dendritic spines are really important for memory, learning, other kinds of things. And as I looked at them, and maybe they'll correct me if I'm wrong, that during that postnatal period, as we move to adolescence, they start to grow more dendritic spines as people have a more rich environment or learning more kinds of things. As they get older, they're not using certain kinds of things and they get pruned away. Like, let's say, for example, a child is learning something in terms of language. In adolescence and early adulthood, they stop speaking language, and then the spine gets pruned away, and that sort of thing. So I'm thinking about that and thinking, since I was talking with some of the your neuroscience scholars here, PhD students earlier, and some of the professors here, was that things that degrade the dendritic spines then make us more vulnerable to things like neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. Again, it gets me back to that story I was talking about a little earlier about the Chimene Indians in the Brazilian rainforest, or the Bolivian rainforest, how they have less aging in the brain, healthier hearts, and they're less stressed. They eat very differently, like hunter-gatherers, and they have very similar profiles of APOE3 genes that would, or E4 genes that would predict, they have a higher maybe frequency of Alzheimer's disease, which they're not getting. Well, so what's that all about, right? So I'm thinking about, how when these are compromised, we have a larger degree of that sort of probability to getting those kinds of diseases, right? Like Alzheimer's disease. However, we know there are things that mediate it in those cultures, right? I can't get the full thing on the screen here, but we do know that, when the chronic stress is taken away, then these dendritic spines can recover. The other part, I've talked about this before, is I've been really kind of looking at telomeres at the end of the chromosomes, and really spent a lot of time looking at Elizabeth Blackburn's work. She was a Nobel Prize winner studying telomeres. So it got me interested, so I started reading a lot about that and about how telomeres protect, the chromosome, and how they divide and become shorter naturally, and so on, but also chronic stress degrades them too as well. So in the idea of molecular colonization, I think, well, in this particular study around depression and stress and telomeres, this one study talked about how middle-aged people who are physically active, like Indigenous people used to be very physically active. And one of the things I'll talk about a little later is how one of the first forms of colonization of Indigenous people was to their movement, when they were put on reserves and they couldn't move anymore like they used to move. So their movement was colonized very early. And we know now that that's or I'm convinced now, I should say, that that was a very, very big hit they took to their health and well-being. But people who were physically active had longer telomeres and higher aerobic capacities than people who were sedentary, right? And that's important because now that's an issue for everybody living in this society. The average number, do you know the average number of hours you sit per day? Anyone? 14? Yeah, I think I was reading somewhere between 8 and 9 hours. 8 and 9 hours a day the average person sits, working person, right? In the industrialized world. Think about that, right? How many hours? What do you do with that? What happens to your butt? What happens to your cardiovascular capacity? What happens to your bones? What leads to osteoporosis? Those kinds of things. We don't do things like ancestors did. Anyway, these people that moved, they had telomere lengths that were similar to people much younger than they were. This is the power, though, of depression and anxiety and chronic stress in society. Again, Indigenous people move less than anyone else. I've looked at these global studies, right? Any colonized group of Indigenous people are moving less than any other people, in their society. It's a fact, they move way less. They had these populations and they put these, what do they call those, some kind of step calculators on these people. And they looked at these different populations. And Native Americans and people in Turtle Island move the least of all Indigenous people. I'm not kidding you, this is what the science is showing, And they probably, taking 3,000, 2,000 steps a day used to be taking maybe 20 or 30,000 steps a day, minimum. And carrying a baby, on the back, as they were doing that. Right? So I haven't looked at the number of fractures among Indigenous women, but I would suspect it's quite high because of the lack of movement, right? And the lack of carrying heavy things, right? So anyway, the telomere is shortest for both depressed and healthy participants who are showing chronic stress, right? So meaning even if you're healthy, and so on, chronic stress is still there, telomeres are going to get shorter. And many of the depressed participants had higher levels of cortisol, which of course may explain why their telomeres were shortened even quicker. Again, when you look at the research, the highest levels of anxiety and depression disorders are found among Indigenous colonized populations. That's a fact. That's not, you can't argue that, right? Just like the least movement is. And the highest rates of dementia and Alzheimer's are among Indigenous people. So it's starting to, the formulas, the equation's starting to come together then a bit for me. How about kids? Well, without knowing that you would, just intuit that stressful homes are going to compromise the telomere health of little kids, right? And encode different transmitters that heighten that effect of stress. I imagine like cortisol or norepinephrine or whatever. This particular study here, I should update this. I haven't updated it for a while because there's other studies, but this particular study showed that kids living in the most stressful environments, and I think about stressful environments as poverty, where there's violence, where there's poverty, loss of people in the home, or mortality or morbidity, those kinds of things. Stressful environments. These kids had telomeres that were 40% shorter than those kids living in the most loving, nurturing communities and homes. So, it means to me when I look at this and say, wow, if telomeres protect us from the diseases of aging, what does that say about little kids that are getting shorter telomeres? It's like they're becoming little old people long before, right? They're going to get the diseases of aging much earlier. They're going to get the diabetes, the hypertension, the obesity, the cancers, and those kinds of things probably earlier. I don't want to be, too fatalistic about that, but the probability is there when you start looking at those populations, right? So again, this is same stuff talking about telomere shortening. And of course, anxiety, the last part there, may lead to shorter telomeres that could live to a shorter lifespan. Who do you suppose has the shortest lifespan, life expectancy among Canadian populations? Indigenous folks, right? It's the same thing in the United States, right? So there were some, here's the interesting thing, during the pandemic, in the States, Indigenous people made a little bit of gain. They were losing, then they made a little bit of gain. It's white people that lost, life. So I don't know, just looking at that stat, I'm not sure why it was, because so many people were dying from COVID-19. So this is one that I was really interested in too. It's like this systematic review of all these association between stress and telomere length from these kids from 3 to 15 years of age. And these 11 studies, is somewhat of a meta-analysis, showed that, adversity in childhood, like the adverse childhood experience, right, violence, low socioeconomic status, maternal depression, family disruption, and institutionalization had an impact on telomere length. And so on, you could see that, the erosion that was happening, and of course, later outcomes. But the one this kind of caught me off guard was this last one. A new study has found a link between the loss of a father through death, imprisonment, or parental separation and reduced telomere length in children. Never knew that before. So all those fathers that are incarcerated, all those Indigenous fathers that are incarcerated, disproportionate numbers of them incarcerated, disproportionate number of them that, have died, and a disproportionate number of them that have been separated from their families. So when I talk to social workers, I think that's what we talk about, is like, we try to remove the father right away out of the homes just to make the place safe, right? Without understanding the implications it has for the kids, right? So now we kind of have an understanding about this colonization that's happening at that level. So we don't have any means to fix that right now. We don't have any mediation that happens, It's like most of what happens is that fathers get removed, they get jailed, and they get imprisoned, and maybe they, maybe never go back to their family. But now we know, at least from these studies, and it's some pretty good studies, that it's a really big social cost, right? A big social cost, and also, a cost on the bodies and the brains of these kids. So. And some of you may know this too. We're talking about epigenetics here, about moms that have, really, oh gosh, difficult factors in their lives that shorten their telomeres. It used to be I'd pull up my DNA, I'd show up my DNA analysis, and I'd show it to my mom, because we both had ours done, and analyze my mom's, and then we send it out for further analysis, and you could see my mom had she had all this probability of shortened telomeres. I got all the same thing, right? And then I started to do the backtrack to look at my mom and say, well, okay, so mom, what happened as a wife, as a mother, as a young girl, what happened to your mother, so on. And so when I talked to my mother, it was trauma after trauma, to grandmother, trauma after trauma, great-grandmother's trauma after trauma, to the point where, in the 1800s, the early 1800s, mid-1800s, our people were on a reservation, and they were in a lockdown, and they were experiencing severe starvation. Just like the Nazis, when they occupied Poland, did to the Polish Jews there, they occupied, and those populations ended up with all kinds of issues, starvation, whatever. They passed epigenetically down these telomeres to the successive generations, and so several generations later, you would see these populations with heart disease and cancers disproportionately from that period of starvation and occupation by the Nazis. Same thing happened on different reserves and reservations throughout Turtle Island. That occupation had that kind of grave effect. Still happening in some places, by the way, where you don't have clean water. I was thinking about that. People are saying, well, they do bring water into some of these communities in Canada because they polluted all the water. And what kind of water do they bring in? Bottled water that's filled with millions and millions of pieces of nano and microplastics. The people drink that, gets into the body, gets into the man's sperm. It kind of makes its way up through the blood-brain barrier and gets into the brain of these people that are drinking this water because they've been starved out and their water's been polluted and so on. They don't have access to water anymore. So the humane thing is to bring them bottled water, which is polluted with plastics, right? It doesn't make any sense, but that's settler colonialism. That's what you do to people when you've got them marginalized, right? So anyway, when I think about how telomeres are passed on, to baby, we talked about the story earlier. I was mentioning how my mother was telling me, my mom passed away in 2022 at the age of 94. And she talked about her great-grandmother telling stories about how women of our tribe were not supposed to witness violence. They weren't supposed to be around blood or anything that would upset them because it would affect the baby. So the women were taken from the regular village, and they were in birthing lodges with all their sisters and mothers, grandmothers, and all these people, and songs, and they did all these ceremonies with them because there was a belief that what happened to, what they experienced would go onto the baby, right? It wasn't called, telomeres or epigenetics back then. It was just saying, this is what happens. We've observed that the mother gets so much exposure to this, nastiness of life, war, or whatever, it's going to end up in baby somehow, right? So mom used to tell us those stories all the time, right? So your great-grandma told us. So when we think about life factors now today, again, these are things that, are just sort of rampant among some populations of many people, but Indigenous in particular: abuse, poverty, isolation, the lack of safety, rumination about bad things, poor diet, poor sleep, trauma, fear, anxiety, depression, obesity, and you can go on and on and on, which are those kinds of things. This is kind of the product of settler colonialism. This is the part that Trickster didn't bring into the literature to let us learn about. It's all kept over here. So we don't look at these things really as socio-cultural kinds of factors. We look at them as sort of some aberration that happened at one point. But I can guarantee you these are things that people live with and have lived with for generations, right? It's really clear to me. I've lived in Winnipeg for the last almost 6 years. Lived at UBC. I was a professor at UBC for a while. My return trip to Canada to be the dean at the Faculty of Social Work, I've learned so much more about racism than I ever have when I've looked at, how people have been treated in the medical system. It's terrible. I look at how Indigenous people are treated in the medical system, in the healthcare system. It's like, wow, these people are like left to die in emergency rooms, or they're mistreated by the nurses, or they're talked down to, or they're treated. I mean, it's just like, thinking about that, how does truth and reconciliation happen in a system that's so colonized, right? And you got a mother in there, she's gonna have a baby, and she's exposed to this kind of abuse and this kind of racism and stuff. You're setting up the perfect storm again to change this, and colonize these molecular systems in the body that happen at that level. And it's something I think we should need to be concerned about. And you as scientists, as people, should probably, I think, advocate to, talk with more people about that. It's not just racism, right? It's a big deal, but it's the consequence of that happens to the body that we're not talking about, right? That sets these kids up for life that we don't know why these Indians are committing suicide or why they're dying so early. There's something wrong with them, but that something wrong with them probably happened 2 or 3 generations ago, or a generation ago. And it's happening now, being passed on to the next generations. So that's a consequence. Someone have a question? No? Right, residential school experiences, yeah. Yeah, that's clearly, one of those things. And I think that, you brain scientists know this better than me about rumination and about introspection, in theory, about what happens to the brain that ruminates on negativity, what happens to the brain that, spends a lot of its time, what happens to the chemistry, what happens to, the cellular structures in the body when it's there, reliving that experience. And again, you probably know better than I that, there are certain people that are more vulnerable to ruminations like that, that have certain genetic factors, a couple of alleles or copies of, ADRA2B, which kind of increases what they call emotionally enhanced vividness. So a person not only sees the residential school experience, but they see the blood, they hear the sounds more vividly than the rest of us do because they have a couple of copies of this gene that makes it even more real, that doesn't go away, what people sometimes call complex trauma. But we know there's a connection now to it genetically, right? So decolonization. Sorry, this didn't turn out as colorful as it usually is. Anyway, so decolonization, of course, is all this stuff about, I have cleansing, stripping away harmful, invasive thoughts, practices, and beliefs and values. And this part of, I think, is part of the, where Coyote now is saying, okay, let's move to this place here. Right? That were imposed by colonizing structures. And the Renaissance period is kind of in the here and now. What we're doing now, what people are doing now, is the restoration of cultural practices, thinking and beliefs and values that were taken away or abandoned during the period of colonization. People are trying to restore those kinds of things in different communities across Turtle Island, be it language programs, gardening programs, be it parenting, whatever it is. Those kinds of things are happening. The Enlightenment period is kind of an interesting time for us now, I think, because I think we're also in the age of enlightenment. And I keep on thinking about how it's important it is to birth and use new ideas, thinking, and technologies that advance the well-being and empowerment of Indigenous people. So I've got an AI project in the States I'm working on right now, and I'm trying to work on more AI projects. And the AI project is a project that I'm using with Indigenous youth and teaching them how to use this technology so that they can apply it to saving res dogs, first of all. And the next thing, it's true, yes, we're working on that. But the other thing too is they're going to use this AI to also bring Indigenous knowledge and AI to learn language, to extend language, to identity, and history, and also their own health. And finally, the last thing is they're going to use the AI and Indigenous knowledge to figure out who's going to be the first Arikara, that's my tribe, to live on Mars, right? So something like that. But also they're going to try to use that to kind of configure what their history is going to look like, what their preferred history would be. So they can use that technology not as an existential threat, but as an existential opportunity to use that knowledge in that way. So we've got the technology we've always had. We've always used technology as Indigenous people, starting with fire, to horses, to guns, to everything else we have. And that's the idea there is how do we move in that direction? And so enlightenment also means that, we can draw from these other areas too as well. So these are some of the things that, that I've kind of been working on in my own work, like earth-based contemplative practices. And in order to kind of heal the brain of people, and I've spent a lot of time in contemplative practices since 1975, when I was an undergraduate. That's a long time ago when I was in college. And I was in college even before that, but I first started doing meditation practices way back then. But then I realized when we do meditation practices, we've always done meditation practices in ceremony, even before that when I was a kid. So the idea of cleansing and decolonizing is encouraging people to take an inventory of your thoughts and beliefs and how they are shaped by colonization, the ruminations, the foods, the thoughts we have. And then the practice is helping people seek and create a safe space, to cleanse from colonialism. And the Renaissance is, of course, all the things that, we're doing now that are going to help us sort of bring back, those things that are important to us, like traditional and contemporary spiritual songs, dances, prayers, symbols, ceremonies, rituals, all the way down to the prophecies, of Indigenous people. So that's just a piece. It's not the end all be all, but it's an integration of these things into the life. And again, that's the practices. Then how do you raise the creativity of people, right, to do that? And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute here. So when I think about, something like contemplative practices, I think about how important stillness is and why stillness was such a big deal to, Indigenous people in contemplation. And this is what kind of the definition of mindfulness is, this complete awareness of your thoughts and experiences and on a moment-to-moment basis. And meditation is an actual kind of practice that we do, when you focus on a prayer, a song, or a word for extended periods of time to promote spiritual growth and reduce stress and so on. All the things that, we know now from the contemplative science is that when a person engages in deep, contemplation, after 11 hours, this is one research that was done by Posner and others, that after 11 hours, you start, rebuilding, white matter in the brain, right? And that's important because the brain connectivity improves, brain's talking to itself back and forth, in a much better way. We know more is better. This is my second youngest girl. Now she's She's 5 here, now she's 11. No, she's 12, sorry. She would say, 12, Dad. Come on. But, more is better. And so when I think about that, I say, wow, yeah, that's really important because it does, begin to increase, our better memory, a sense of self, empathy, get better, the level of stress go down. This is what I was trying to think of earlier today when we were having a conversation, is the insula. And we know, from the research that insula, of course, is also, besides everything it does, in terms of its gut feeling, but also controls the mental emotions and regulation of the body's homeostasis and, helps control negative emotions, which makes a lot of sense to me. Of course, when you're thrust into a society from settler colonialism, you're bound to have a lot of negative emotions floating around in that brain and that body. So how does one mediate that? TPJ, temporal parietal junction, of course. The key thing about this one I really thought was kind of cool was that after I read about it, and some of my colleagues who are neuroscientists in the States had these conversations with them about different parts of the brain. And one of my close friends is a guy by the name of Rick Hansen. He just published a book called Buddha Dharma, and he's a book on Buddha's brain and so on. He's a pretty respected neuroscientist in the States, and I serve on his board for the Global Coalition on Compassion. But him and I are pretty good friends, and so I'm asking him these questions about that, and he said, "Well, what about this ability to perceive the emotional state of others?" So he was giving me all the sort of neuroscience stuff of that. I said, "Well, imagine this. Tell me if I'm way off here." I said that in a village at one point, if people had their enough activation in this junction here, this circuit here, I said, could they also read the emotional state of animals? Would that be possible if you got to know animals well enough? I said, what about, and I'm kind of taking it off, right? What about, could you read the emotional state of the river? Could you read the emotional state of the grass and the forests? He said, that's an interesting question. I said, if you had people that were doing that all the time, that they would sit there and they would sit before a river, they would sit before a forest, or they would sit before, whatever, an animal, and they would read that animal, they'd say, yeah, I think we can understand the emotional state of that animal, right? Not to say in anthropomorphic, terms, or in human terms, but could you do that? So we had this interesting discussion on that. I said, oh, I don't know. It'd be interesting, something to kind of examine, right? I said, well, it seems that some people think they can. Some people kind of think they know what their dog needs or the cat needs all the time, right? Or horse people says, I know what my horse is thinking. I've got a good friend, his name is Monty Roberts, who's a really, really well-known horse trainer. He's real famous. He actually trains horses for the Queen. And him and I have had conversations about this too as well. And he's the man who speaks to horses, not the man who listens to horses. He's not a horse whisperer, but he's the man, he listens to horses, doesn't speak to horses. So we were talking about that, and I said, well, what do you mean when you listen to horses? He said, well, that's exactly what I mean. He said, you sit there, you look at a horse, and a horse will talk to you through his body language, through its eyes, through its head, through its posture, through its gait, through, how it stands. I said, so you read the emotional state of the animal? Yeah, somewhat. He said, I can tell when a horse is stressed. I can tell when it's having a bad day. I can tell you when it's having a good day, right? Now, this is a man who's very famous. If you look him up, Google him, Monty Roberts, look at all the horse training he's done. He's, takes a wild animal from off the plains and he puts it in, into a pen within a half an hour, he's on its back, or he's older, he's in the 80s now, but somebody's on his back, right? He gets the horse to partner up with him by having certain kinds of, body and emotional movements and expressions he does with the animal, which is, it's a prey animal. It's not a predator. So he knows how to read the animal in that way. So I'm thinking about that. Maybe that part of the brain then really was working in terms of Indigenous people so that they could read the water, read the forest, read the animals and so on. So I don't know, you neuroscientists might think I'm a little crazy here, but I need a brain scan or something, but anyway. So this, I know we're close to time. I think I've shown this to people before, but so when I think about contemplation is one of the ideas about, you know, what can make a better brain for Indigenous people. I kind of I don't put all my eggs in one basket, but I sort of really lean towards contemplative practices is something that's, you know, really important. Also, I'll have a lot of stuff in here about movement, but I won't do that as well. But I was looking at some of the things that people have found in the research that after 100 hours of meditation practice, you know, neural and hormonal indicators of lessened stress reactivity, you know, like your amygdala, the fear part of the brain, calms down. The hormonal, you know, indicators as cortisol levels go down and are more controlled. Stronger emotional regulation, interoception, you know, the sensing, you know, your internal states gets better. This is me. Can you guess which one is me? So this is a class I had when I was a professor at Humboldt, Cal Poly Humboldt, and some MSW class we had. And so this gets back to what I was talking about earlier about, you know, decreased brain aging. So some of the research shows that, you know, there's a possibility of decreased brain aging up to 7.5 years less than compared to baseline people that don't meditate. These are people that, I think these cohorts were looking at people up to age 70 or so, 50 to 70 or whatever, who had meditated like 1,000 hours. They could, you know, prove they did 1,000 hours. And when they did brain scans, they could see, huh, brain is a lot younger than, you know, than controls. Increased connectivity got even higher between amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. You know, there's the planning part, the rational part, talking with the fear part, much better, like take it easy, relax, you know. The decreased size of the nucleus accumbens associated with feelings of attachment and wanting. Now, I want to ask you neuroscientists, what else is the nucleus accumbens associated with besides attachment and wanting? Zzz, time's up. Is it associated with self? Okay, we'll move on. Move on. I guess there's, you know, there's some people that think it is, you know, associated with self. So slower baseline breathing rate and also solving working memory problems, which are something like this. We talked about this earlier, but think about this for a second about how society has put all of us, but particularly Indigenous people, into a place where you've got all these things happening. What's happening to the brain? Well, of course, when your working memory is suffering lack of focus, you're needing to reread something. That's not just graduate school or PhD programs for folks. It's like, you know, needing to reread. Difficulty staying engaged. It's not that I'm boring. It's difficult. You have a difficulty staying engaged. Okay. Forgetting the steps to completing something. Constantly losing your keys, cell phone, wallet, purse. This is one of my personal favorites, this next one. You want to join in a conversation, but by the time the other person stops talking, you forgot what you wanted to say. Right? This is some brain scans that were done looking at gray matter loss in the brain. So you can see the controls have lost a lot more gray matter than the meditators, right? After 5,000 of hours of practice, so these were, I think the people that did this studies were Richard Davidson and Daniel Goleman, I believe. So if you're interested in the book, it's called Altered Traits. So they talk about, they look at all the research there. So I thought it was pretty cool. Decreased stress response, increased attention and working memory. This is the one that really got me. I said, wow, okay, this sounds like reverse aging happening here, right? Small improvements in molecular markers of cellular aging. I was thinking, oh, that's got to be telomeres. It's got to be their telomeres are recovering from stress, and there must be, you know, improving that cellular aging there. I don't know, but you know, that was just a thought that I had. Decreased activation of the monkey mind, which is the default mode network, you know, all over the place. And these are my girls here when we lived in Fargo on warmer days in North Dakota. So I want to ask neuroscientists about this because I've just read about it. What are gamma oscillations? Do they exist? So tell me if, because I was reading this, and there's even a study linked to this, but it's like when you're, after 10,000 hours of practice, right, you get this huge lift in creativity and problem solving. It's kind of what it looks like. You're sort of at another place. And what some of the literature says is that the brain becomes maximally sensitive, like you're picking up sight, sound, taste, touch, smell, more than you ever could, you know, and also that the brain goes into a place of what they call low or no power use, that it's just sort of here. It's not distracted, but it's here, not using the amount of power it normally uses, which kind of brings the person to another state. Does that make sense? Okay. Half the neuroscientists went like this, the other half saying, I don't know. I don't know what you're talking about, man. It doesn't work for me. Okay. Brain patterns are similar. The shrunken nucleus accumbens. Now, this is what I found, and this is what I thought they said, is that the shrunken nucleus accumbens also, there's a part of it that is about identifying with self. So I said, oh, that makes kind of interesting sense to me, because I was talking to my friend Rick about this, and he said, I don't know. He said, and he's a neuroscientist too, you know. So I'm like, okay, so let me, because I said I thought I read this, is that the shrunken nucleus accumbens, when it's presenting this is who I am, this is what I'm all about, and this is why I'm the most important person in the world, pay attention to me, here's my selfie, you know, those kinds of things. When it begins to shrink, then what happens is that you identify more with the group and the community and the people, less identification with self, meaning that you have a stronger connection. Does that make sense? Now, I don't know if that's true, but I want to ask you, but I'll check it out some more then. And some voluntary control over pain. So I'm going to just go ahead and stop there. Yeah. So let me go on to some traditional indigenous practices, which I think, now this is one. This is this man meditating back in about 1903 in my community, and he is meditating on these sacred pipes here, right? So I've got this other colleague, Andrew Newberg. I don't know if you know who he is, I think, but he's a neuroscientist, neurotheologist or something. Anyway, he works with spirituality and neuroscience. He wrote this book called How God Changes Your Brain. It's really a pretty interesting book. It talks about how, you know, people that believe in a God, that, you know, these studies he looked at that were done in the States, 4 types of God, 4 images of God by people. One God is the, you know, God of, retribution. You make any mistakes, I'm going to get you. The other God is the critical God, like, oh, you shouldn't have done that, you know. But, you know, don't do that, you know. And the other one is the distant God, just watching from distance and let you do your thing. And the final God is the God of benevolence, the God of love, right? Love everything. Love your neighbor, love the trees, love that res dog, right? Love everything. And found out that, you know, roughly about 25% believe in the God of retribution, and another 23% believe in the God of, you know, criticism, and then another 25% or 26% believe in the distant God. And the smallest population that believe in a benevolent God is about, you know, are about less than 20% or 20% of the people. And from his research, he showed when he looked at imaging, when people talk about, you know, their fearful God or their critical God or the God, you know, of retribution, that the amygdala, the fear part of the brain, becomes very activated, right? Now, the people that believe in a loving God, very different part of the brain gets activated, called the anterior cingulate cortex, you know, circuit or whatever. It's about love and compassion. He said, it's interesting, he said, because he said, he asked me, he said, did indigenous people have a hell? I said, not that I know of, you know, not like heaven and hell kind of thing, afterlife. I said, no, there was no talk like that. How about a devil or that? Well, these people believed in evil, but they didn't believe in a devil, I don't think. He said, but the Europeans had that. They had a devil and they had heaven and hell and that sort of thing. And so that part of the brain activates, right? Anyway, so I thought it was interesting. So anyway, the whole point of the story is like my working memory, right? whole part of the story was that this is his slide here. And I said, can I use your slide for this? He said, okay, sure. So when you're looking at the attention area, when this man is meditating on these pipes, you see the attention area of the meditation, the left prefrontal cortex activated, right? So when I was looking at Richard Davidson's work and Andrew's work, that's the point of the brain that's associated with well-being, a sense of well-being and joy and happiness. So I said, well, that's kind of probably what's happening in this man's brain, because I know a little bit about pipes and how people think about them. Also know that this is some work that he was doing with looking at meditators who had this, he scanned the brains of these nuns and Buddhist monks undergoing these mystical experiences. And what they reported to him was this sense of timelessness, spacelessness, and self-transcendence, right? So he did all these brain scans. And he saw this reduced activity in their parietal lobes and this orientation area of the brain that's responsible for three-dimensional objects in space and, you know, visual spatial reasoning and so on. So he said that these people were, you know, experiencing this sense of a oneness with all living things, or unity, because this part of the brain had gone offline, that parietal lobe. And so we were talking about that. I said, yeah, that's probably what was happening with also with indigenous spiritual people, is that they were getting so deep into it that that part of the brain was going offline, and they were having this experience where they were connecting to the sacred, you know, whatever there was. Maybe it was a river, or a tree, or a forest, or creator, or whatever it was. So we talked a bit about that. These are also men from my community. Back in about 1903, they're members of what they call the Duck Society. And for them, they had a strong connection to the duck, you know, the humble duck, right? I'm not talking about the Chinatown duck, I'm talking about the humble duck, right? So neuroscientists don't like to laugh at my jokes, I noticed, so, but anyway, okay. Anyway, so they, you know, it's interesting because, you know, I was asking my dad, I said, why was it, what's about the ducks? He said, well, he said, you know, the people kind of really saw, you know, the fullness of everything. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, what do ducks do that no other animal can do? I don't know, quack? He said, no, think about it. He said, they can swim, they can fly, and they can walk on water, right? He said, a buffalo can't do that, you know, no other animal can do that, you know, except a duck, maybe a swan or whatever, geese or whatever. But he's, you know, that's the kind of thing they had going on, is that they saw that. But this is, so again, this is Andrew's slide here, parietal lobe going offline. So I said, this is what made sense to me in terms of my people and indigenous people. I know now what these guys are doing because I know the ceremonies they did. This is a ceremony to Atna Tawissa, the mother who comes to help the people. You know, our Christians have Jesus. We had Mother Corn. That was our mediator between the people. She was a female deity, wasn't male. And these men here are around a sacred tree of life, and they're singing songs to this tree, sacred songs. And they're singing to this tree as if it was, and to them in their minds, a real mother. It was someone who came to help them, who gave them gifts, and who was there for them. And they sang all these songs, and they would sing these songs for 10,000 hours, right, in their lifetime or whatever. But they would sing to the song over and over again, and they would believe this, and it was like a prayer they were doing all the time. They did it throughout the year, but mostly during the fall, summer, and spring months, they would do that during ceremonial time. And they spent all day there. So their retreats were like, you know, 120 days. They weren't retreats, I don't know why I call them retreats. I was thinking of Buddhist retreats. But they were there, and they would sing, you know, for 6 hours a day. And then for 2 or 3 hours a day, they would sit and they would eat and they would still pray, and they would joke and laugh around. The next day, they'd get up and do it again. They'd get up and do it again. They'd get up and do it again, because they were calling the mother to come in to help the people. That was their job. So I said, I was telling, I was, you know, telling some of the people in my community, I said, so that's just kind of what I think people were doing, is that as they did this is what was happening to the brain. And think about it, it's making a better brain. It's making a better body, right? And this is kind of more modern version of a sun dance. You see the trees with the tree with the life with the tobacco ties there. And these are some things, maybe I'll end with this one here. Some things I found that I think are really important traditional practices that should be brought into contemporary neuroscience on behalf of Indigenous people. And I think for me, they're important because these are things that are supported by the literature. There's good science on running and dancing and singing and sleep, and some of these I won't go through all of them, but like, running does this, but the thing it does, the point number 4, BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, we know now from a lot of research is that, the brain produces that, and you grow more neurons and you protect the existing neurons, neurogenesis happens. The one I was particularly interested too is this last one, where I was looking at this study that says that regular endurance exercise, we're talking about how much we love to run, right? How much we love to run, and causes these adaptations in curcumin metabolism expression. But all the way down, as we move, it shifts away from the curcumin metabolism, away from this neurotoxic curcumin to the production of chorionic acid. And I said, oh, okay. When you colonize people and you take away their running and their movement, of course they're going to get depression then. This is one of those factors then that can reduce depression, right? Which should be one of the most prescribed medications there is movement, running, right? So that's BDNF. You all know this pretty much. The long-term, improves long-term memory, higher order thinking, higher order learning, miracle growth for the brain, helps develop new brain connections, and repair failing brain cells. I'm trying to go faster. Protect healthy brain cells. I like this picture a lot. This old grandma here. She's out there doing a road race. And I was looking at the sciences. How do you increase BDNF? So I was looking at exercise, being on the land, avoiding sugar. We are a sugar-eating society. Fasting, intermittent fasting, mental stimulation, sleep, eating fatty fish, wild game for the omega-3 fatty acids, anti-inflammatory foods, turmeric and blueberries. I started doing golden milk drinks again. I don't do milk, but dairy milk, but I do plant-based milk. You know what golden milk drinks are, anyone? Yeah, so turmeric, a little bit of cinnamon, not the lead kind of cinnamon, because there's a lot of lead in cinnamon, and then black pepper to kind of activate the turmeric, and maybe a little cardamom. Heat it up, drink it, brings down the level of inflammation, in the body, probably in the brain too as well. Mild bioenergetic stress, something our people did. We did not have showers. Where we bathed? I can tell you, because we used to do that outside. When I was a kid, we didn't have any running water. We'd go outside and melt some snow water, take a cold shower. And, when we were kids, my mom would heat some of it sometimes, with cold most of the time. Hot sauna, cold showers, increases, of course, heat shock proteins in the body and, of course, in the cells, indicator of, health. Meditation, mindfulness, probiotic foods. Dancing, just a couple more here. We know dancing, again, was one of those things that was taken away from Indigenous people. But we know now from research is that dancing, raises endocannabinoids. And also singing, right? In this particular study, you see that singing was the most beneficial activity in the study. You get the biggest raise from endocannabinoids. And what did they do? Of course, they're known to improve mood, reduce stress and anxiety, enhance memory, protect the brain function, and reduce pain. So it's interesting when I talk about this, I do this talk, I'll say, gosh, you've got these high levels of neurodegenerative diseases among Indigenous people that have climbed exponentially. Dementias and Alzheimer's, this dementia. And yet you've got all these things that protect the brain, like singing, dancing, fasting, probiotic foods, all the things that were moved away from Indigenous people. Now they had these really difficult brain disorders, right? And then you've got trauma and stuff. Dancing, improvements in memory, attention, and focus. The one I thought was pretty cool, I've been looking at these studies in the dance literature. This 10-month ballroom dancing class improved the mild cognitive impairment of older people in the program. And of course, it's part of our collective DNA. I was looking at some of this work by Berglund, and of course, dancing on a regular basis seems to the way we think and interact with one another. Survival mechanism, dancing, and form bonds between people. these are some of my people here again, singing. These are bear singers. And what's cool about this is that, you know, I know a little bit about that. My mother is from the Bear Society, so I've heard stories from her and some of my relatives. But they're singing about, you know, the bear. They're singing about the people and feeling a sense of empathy. So empathy is rising. But we know that when they sing together real closely and they're doing this, the oxytocin levels are going to rise, right? It's going to bond them. Dopamine levels, the reward they get from doing this for the people, going to go up. Cortisol levels going to go down. Testosterone levels go up, right? Makes perfect sense to me. Like, these are the things that people were doing for a long time before colonization came and said, you can't do that anymore. That's primitive stuff. So what do? Sit here and do what everyone else does, but it doesn't work for Indigenous people, right? This is really the last slide, right? So I looked at this. I thought this was when I was looking at this particular article. I found this and I thought, wow, this is pretty cool here because it tells, you know, about the musical and social brain, right? What happens to the brain that's engaged in music and social activity that's cultural, right? Empathy circuits are activated there. You can see those in the anterior cingulate cortex, right? With the music and dancing and, you know, oxytocin levels are being secreted there when people are singing together, right? When you think about how people are singing in the village together or singing over a burial or singing over the birth of a child or whatever, those things are all banned, you know, in settler colonialism, right? And so that's the trickster part. Doesn't want us to know about how important these things are, right, in neuroscience. Cortisol levels are decreasing. Language structures, you know, call and response, interesting. The singer calls and the participants sing back to the person, right? And the last thing is the dopamine reward, right? Drives motivation and so on. So I'm going to stop here and see if there's any questions. I know.
This has been a very powerful presentation, Michael. I thank you very much for the time, for sharing your wisdom. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us today. We'll have another presentation in about a month. Quite different, more on the neuroscience side of things, talking more about gamma waves, actually. So hope you'll join us then, 27th September, or February, sorry. Thank you.